Um, Welcome, everybody. This is the Biblical Criticism Book Club. We are discussing Richard Carrier's book on the historicity of Jesus, Why We Might Have Reason for Doubt. I think this is our 11th Hangout on this book.
Yes.
Quite a big book, so it's taken us a while on it. And we're basically in Chapter 7 right now, 7, Section 5, page 270. This section is talking about the different sources of primary evidence we have regarding early Christianity. And he's basically summarizing a little bit of what he's going to be talking about later. So pretty much everything he talks about here, he goes into more detail in later chapters. He just finished talking about the Gospels and the dating of them. He doesn't want to spend the time it would take to solve all the dating issues to actually really research what's going on. He figures it would take like 7 years of full-time research to untangle the issues going on with the dating of biblical texts, and he just doesn't want to do it. Regarding some of these texts, like the Gospels and Paul's letters, he's amendable, I guess. I mean, that's not the right word. Think about thesaurus. To the people who want to give late dates, I mean, he thinks they have the better arguments, but he doesn't think they're conclusive. He doesn't think the arguments for late dates are conclusive. And for the sake of making this argument in this book as palatable as possible to different audiences, he's arguing for the most conservative dates, that are plausible. So he's accepting fairly conservative dates, basically like Mark in the 70s, and then the other Gospels like a decade after, successive decades after that. Acts, he pretty much agrees that it's late, but he, for the sake of argument, will take a normal dating that puts it in the 90s.
What? Should you repeat all that?
Not when we're live, no.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out why this is not running the way it usually runs.
The Hangout or your software?
My software.
Oh.
But anyway, that's
okay.
beside the point.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about Acts at the last Hangout anyway. We highly recommended people read the Acts Seminar Report, and plus the works of Richard Purvo and what was the other one? I know John knows the name I'm thinking of. I just got to remember what it was. Tyson.
Oh.
I forgot his first name for a moment. What was Tyson's full name? Joseph B. Tyson, yeah.
Joe. Nobody Joe. I wish somebody had a electronic version of that book, but
yeah.
I don't think there is one.
I got printed copies of the Acts Seminar Report and one of Marcion and Luke Acts I have hard copy of.
Yeah, that I don't have. So I didn't do all the homework teach.
It's a good book, but I haven't gotten all the way through it because as I was going through it, I realized I wanted to have more background knowledge, so I wanted to read other things first, and then reading them I wanted to read other things first in a giant chain, so I've kind of been going back to basics lately, trying to catch up on stuff. So anyway, let's move on to section 6 then, because we really don't have much. Carrier had very little to say, and we have very little to say on Acts, it seems like here. Extra biblical evidence. Carrier says there's a large variety of largely undatable Christian literature that could have came from anywhere from the mid-1st to late 2nd century. And the problem is we don't know the provenance of the information. We really can't use it as evidence. So there's a lot of literature there that's just not really useful to us just because it's of uncertain origins.
I did read a blog post. I think it was an older post, but he had reposted or something about the whole issue of dating and how he had spent, I don't know how long.
Carrier?
Yeah, I can give the link to that. It's a long post, but basically he's talking about how one thing led to another. You know, once you're trying to get any kind of firm date, it gets slippery, and it ends up being contingent on other things. Like, it's some of the datings of certain things, like say Clement might be contingent on dating something else, but that's debatable, and no one's sure. There's no consensus, or if there is, there's no real basis for the consensus. It's just convenient not to go on about it. Probably because scholars are faced with the same thing, where it's a quandary, you know, whenever you try to get into it. So I guess that's the basis for in the book where he talks. He just accepts the standard dating.
Yeah. A lot of religious apologists, they take the earliest possible date, that's not absolutely ruled out, and then try to claim that as being almost certain. And then that kind of logic just doesn't follow.
And it really doesn't hurt his argument as far as dating goes,
Yeah.
Is what his main contention is. It doesn't really matter if it's late or early. Excuse me.
Yeah. But First Clement is traditionally dated around the year 95, and that's a date pretty widely accepted by scholarship. Yet we have no reason to trust that it was actually written then, or even by Clement of Rome. It's just assumed. And Carrier gives several arguments that it may have been written in the 60s. It mentions Paul and Peter's deaths were. I just jumped here. I don't know why this jumped. Sorry about that. I didn't hit any keys or anything. I don't know what happened. There I am. Peter and Paul's deaths were among those happening most recently. And of being of Clement's own generation. And some of the elders had been appointed by the very apostles themselves. And there's no evidence in the letter to contradict that conclusion. There's nothing that argues for a different date that Carrier's aware of. Clement shows no knowledge of any extant Gospels. He is completely unaware of the fact that the temple at Jerusalem was destroyed. And he seems unaware that the Jews were ever at war with Rome. So those are some of the reasons that Carrier thinks it may have been written from the 60s. I'm not sure, how persuasive those really are.
You mean for the consensus dating?
Yeah. No, these are for 30 years before the consensus dating. These are arguments why they're probably written in the 60s, not in 95.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Carrier is actually arguing for an earlier date for Clement than is generally accepted.
I can't recall. Does he say why he wants to argue for an earlier date?
I just gave 7 of his reasons.
Oh, it's up there. Okay. I was off on it.
Yeah, it mentions Peter and Paul's deaths. It mentions being of Clement's own generation. It talks about the elders having been appointed by the very apostles themselves. And there's nothing in evidence, there's nothing in the letter contradicting that date. He also shows no knowledge of any of the Gospels, or that the temple was destroyed, or that the Jews had ever had a war with Rome. Of course, if somebody's trying to forge an epistle and make it seem early, I can't hear myself.
Sorry.
If somebody later was trying to forge an epistle and make it look early, they might, intentionally put some of these things in, but that doesn't seem plausible in this case, just because it's just so weak of an evidence to date it. If they're actually trying to fake a date of it, they'd probably do it more decisively. Does that make sense, John?
Yes. Yeah,
I find Carrier's dating totally plausible. I mean, it's been a while since I've read Clement. I have read it a couple of times before. I noticed, I agree with him that there's nothing about the historical Jesus at all in Clement.
When I was reading that discussion on that section, I thought it's a good case, but a lot of things do seem good until you have time to mill it over. And I can't, I really don't have any opinion as to how, where there might be a problem with that. So I guess we could let that go. Sounds reasonable enough.
Yeah, like I said, each of these things individually seems like something a forger might do. So I mean, it's not a proof positive for an early date, but yeah, I think not having stronger evidence that somebody's trying to force it to that date, like a forgery would do, I think they'd make a stronger case. So it looks pretty legit to me that it actually might be from the 60s. I think Carrier's on to something here.
Yeah, because as you say, a forger would have more detail from a later time, more, some of the things that are missing.
Yeah. Well, like the book of Daniel, trying to put several centuries in the past. I mean, the forger's making it clear, this is the time I'm writing. It's actually not, but he's claiming a particular time in detail. Or like Second Peter and stuff, claiming to be written in the first century by Peter. It doesn't. It's not, but it claims to be quite clearly.
Yeah, that seems to be like the opposite type, though, of the same coin, where it's like there's anachronisms.
You think there's anachronisms? So that'd be interesting.
Not in Clement, but some of the examples that you gave. There's, even though the author attempts to locate it in an earlier time, there's certain things that slip to where that, there's anachronistic mentions of various events that could not possibly have been known to the author had they been writing at the time.
Yeah, but do we find that in Clement at all?
Not that I could see.
Yeah,
and it's not like I actually tried to read it years ago, and the main thing that struck me was the biblical quotations, especially the ones where nobody knows where the heck they're from.
Yeah.
I'd like to get a hold of that one.
Yeah. Carrier says regarding all the other extra-biblical Christian texts, we have pretty much the same conclusion. They can't be established as early, and thus they can't be established as independent. All the other Christian texts, every single one of them seems most plausibly explained as being derivative from the Gospels and stuff. So.
Just lost Abel and Alfred.
Oh no, was I that boring? I saw other people talking and not me.
Well, Abel had a phone call apparently, so he had to probably do something. And I don't know, all of a sudden Wayman said, "I can't hear myself," or something like that, and then he dropped out. So, but he did mention something about problems, I think. Anyway, well, we might as well keep going.
Yeah. The other Christian texts, none of them contains anything either different from what's found in the New Testament, or that's believable even if different. So when it's different, they're pretty ridiculous and pretty obviously not true. Where they're plausible, they're pretty much just repeating the gospel story.
Exactly.
Of non-Christian extra-biblical evidence, there is none that can be established as independent and reliable. Like the Babylonian Talmud, it's a very late source. It's from the 5th century. All other non-Christian extra-biblical sources do not say anything substantially different from known Christian literature. Therefore, it cannot be established as independent.
Hold on 1 second.
Yep. 1,000. 2 1,000. 3 1,000. Okay, that joke's not funny anymore.
I want to check on something here, the Jesus Mystery, Lena Einhorn, but I'll tell you how that's possibly relevant in a minute.
Okay.
Okay. There's an extensive section in that book, Jesus Mystery, where she tries to make the case that Jesus is actually mentioned, the historical Jesus is mentioned in the Talmuds, the various literature. But
Well, yeah, there are mentions of Jesus in the Talmud, but they all seem to be
which one?
responses to.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there's also
which Talmud? Yeah.
and there's also a controversy over whether or not that the Jesus in the Talmuds, and there are several mentions of them, are in any way related to the Christian Jesus. So that's
Carrier believes they are, but he believes
yeah,
their reactions to it, and the
yeah.
reactions to it is a version of Christianity, according to Carrier.
I was kind of convinced the other way around, and despite the fact that I read Einhorn's book after I had read the consensus, I still wasn't convinced by her arguments, and she did an extensive job of trying to show, you know, that she felt there was good evidence to suggest it. So I'm still not convinced that the things we have in there are any way related. It's because you would think again that there would be some more specific things, and it only touches here and there on possible connections to the historical Jesus, and if it is, it seems pretty convoluted and warped and stuff like. So it's not easy to hammer in anything that the Jews may have known about Jesus from Christians even into some of this mold. So to me, it's still an open question. But
it probably depends which Talmud we're talking about, I believe here.
that's true, and even though I think it's been a while since I read the book, so she might consider both the Jerusalem and the Babylonian Talmud. But the consensus is, well, I wouldn't even say consensus. Probably not. But I think there's a strong scholarly leaning towards there being of no use for historical Jesus studies. So, but there's also other Jewish literature that should be taken into account as well. And as you say, that stuff is late. That I would agree with. Yeah. Even though some of the Talmudic sources may be first century or even earlier.
Yeah, we'll get to that in Carrier here, though. That's actually coming up here. So, so I was hoping we could actually discuss the chapters themselves more, but I'm too kind of scatterbrained right now to really do that, unless there's something in the text that you wanted to bring up.
Well, you can tell I'm really, really with it right now.
Yeah. I'm following my outline I did today, but I'm kind of worn out, and I'm not really thinking past what I have in the outline. Everyone agrees all the Christian doctrines. Okay, there's a problem of compromised evidence. He's talking on 275 to 277. Everybody agrees that all the Christian documents so far mentioned have been selected, forged, meddled with, or edited, in different ways. The New Testament itself underwent a considerable amount of editing, interpolation, and revising over the course of its first 2 centuries. And not merely as a result of transcription and scribal error, but often with specific dogmatic intent. Like we've talked here before about the Catholic redactor expanding the Pauline corpus.
Right.
Yeah. And we also think that canonical Luke is probably an expansion of an earlier. It seems to be an expansion of the Marcionite gospel, if not directly, then indirectly. There's also the addition to the last chapter to Mark and various things like that. There's lots of examples.
Yeah, and some of the footnotes he explores some of for instance, he uses Dr. Price as an example when Dr. Price discusses interpolation in the pre-Nicene New Testament. And although, I can understand where he's coming from, that there's problems with the criteria that are used. For instance, seeing redactional seams, things of that nature, possibly different language or different theology or even other statements that would contradict other parts. All those are good, but there's no evidence because we just don't have any versions of the text that have that stuff without those. It's all conjectural. And there are there's strong cases for some more than others, but ultimately we don't have any direct evidence. We can only surmise.
Well, in the case of the Pauline corpus, we can compare it to attempted reconstructions of the Apostolicon and see some of the differences there, but the reconstruction process itself is conjectural and to a great extent.
And I was also reading some of the other stuff related to that, and using people like Tertullian as a source for what was actually in the
They're kind of late,
The
amount of time span there is kind of.
But it's also worse than that, because there was a case study of just one where it was talking about it's very difficult to untangle Tertullian's polemic from what he writes, and it doesn't necessarily ensure that what he says is in Marcion is actually the way it was written. It's being filtered through his own style of mind and theology and so forth. That there's often places where you can actually kind of determine it, because you have other sources that deal with the same part, where they're just there's different wordings, and he doesn't in any way say this is a direct quote or that kind of stuff. So the modern scholars who attempt reconstructions are much more conservative, because they've come to realize that it's very difficult to say that anything that Tertullian writes is actually the way the text was. Sometimes you can untangle it, sometimes there's just hopeless. You really don't know.
What was the one reconstruction that we used all the time? I just forgot the name of it and the author.
Of what?
Badun's reconstruction. Yeah, he talks about that his goal is not to get the exact Greek text reconstructed. He thinks that's beyond doing. It's just that's too much loss, too far gone. But he says he tries to reconstruct what ideas were in Marcionite's version. What general passages were present or not.
Yeah, I would agree that that's probably the best we can do with the evidence we have. And then, the situation is even worse although there are texts that have certain things that are missing, but it's hard to say whether that goes back to an original kind of stuff, where it's just family errors that things that have changed.
Anyway, but going back to Couchot's article, though, the point Couchot is making is we don't need a perfect reconstruction. I mean, he only used a partial reconstruction that Arnack had, but he said there's enough evidence shown that some funny business is going on. You don't have to have a perfect reconstruction to see the funny business.
Yeah. Also, the modern critical text that they were basically originally Westcott and Hort were like what would you say, conspiracy theorists. They thought there was a deliberate change from what they usually called the Alexandrian text, based on Sinaiticus and Vaticanus and things, and that there was a wholesale revision towards what's now called the Textus Receptus, or the Byzantine majority text. And even though modern textual criticism is descended from their work, they've taken a different tact, where they've come up with more scientific ways of determining that there's been changes. This wasn't a wholesale deliberate conspiracy. They've developed a set of theories about how the text can change and how related texts can cross-fertilize and so forth, and produce the changes without it being deliberate.
Yeah, a good book of that is the Text of the New Testament. God, I forgot the name of the original author of the first edition of it. I should know that. But Bart Ehrman is a co-author of the second or third edition of it.
Bruce Metzger.
Bruce Metzger, yeah, he's the conservative, but he was a really renowned scholar, and he explains all about how the textual criticism works. So it's a really great book, and explains the methods they use. And I haven't actually read the version that Ehrman contributed to. I've only read the original by Metzger.
Yeah, I would like to finish this chapter, and then we could probably end it at that point.
Oh, okay. But extra biblical literature. Of course, I'm sorry, I lost my place here. Oh yeah, literature outside the New Testament often underwent even more of the same, with quite blatant forgery and revision not uncommon. But then he makes another argument. He said, he based on a number of known interpolations in the New Testament, and looking at the kind of the rate of them that we can find, he estimates that there's at least 20 probably significant interpolations we can't detect that have just been lost to time. That's kind of a statistical argument that Carrier makes, that we're probably not really aware of all the interpolations that are there.
Yeah, I would agree with that ultimately, but can't prove it. And statistically, I think he's being conservative.
Yeah, he says he is. Yeah, it's probably way more than 20, but yeah.
Or it's totally inerrant.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's inerrant, that's right. That's why the Gospel of Matthew has the disciples in Galilee, and then they're fishing, and then they see Jesus. And they're all surprised, so they didn't know he was raised from the dead, and it's like a big shock to them. While at the same time, Luke has them all around Jerusalem, and then they see Jesus, and they're all surprised. Because they didn't know he was resurrected before that. And then in Luke and Acts, they stay in Jerusalem until the Holy Spirit comes. So there's no opportunity for them to get to Galilee to go fishing. What the Bible's inerrant.
Oh, those are just apparent contradictions.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good enough for 7.
Yeah, there's a lot of good information in that section, but I don't really want to. I don't know what to say about it.
Yeah, it's just kind of fun facts.
Yeah. So section 8, on page 278, the role of consequent probabilities. So he's already, in an earlier chapter, he explained how to use how he's going to do the prior probability. And he based the prior probability on the best reference class he could find, which he believed was the rank-Raglan class. Here he's talking about how the consequent probabilities are going to work for the evidence. If an item of evidence is more likely on one hypothesis than on another, then it increases the probability of the former hypothesis against the latter. And Bayes' theorem is what does that for us. We basically plug it in, and that's what Bayes' theorem does. That's the purpose of Bayes' theorem. But that alone does not render the supported hypothesis more probable. We have to consider all the evidence, not just a subset of it. And any prior probability against the hypothesis must be overcome.
Right. That's easy.
Yeah. For each piece of evidence, we should ask, how likely is it that we would have this evidence if our hypothesis is true? I mean, is this evidence expected, and how expected? So if we're trying to estimate, an actual number here, percentage chance, things, we kind of need to think kind of deeply about it. How likely is it that the evidence would look like it does if the hypothesis is true? So see, not just that we have the evidence, but that the evidence actually looks a certain way. Instead of looking differently, or instead of having different content, for example. Conversely, how likely is it that we would have this evidence if the other hypothesis is true? So, I mean, no matter how likely the evidence is on your hypothesis, if some alternate hypothesis makes the evidence even more likely, I mean, then it doesn't fare well for your hypothesis. You have to compare. You can't just look at the one hypothesis in isolation.
Yeah, that is what kind of like saves this line for me. Yeah. Because that's the first thing you would think of as an objection. So, it's good that it's covered this way.
Yeah. How likely is it that the evidence would look like it does if that other hypothesis is true? Instead of looking differently or having different content, for example. So basically, how likely to have evidence at all, or how likely the evidence to be how it is, given our hypothesis and the alternative hypotheses. So you basically have a matrix of 4 possibilities there.
And the area that he gets the most objections to is, and it's not, and I can agree with him that it just seems this way, but it's twisted by people that have objections, is that you're also including evidence that we don't have. And a lot of people want to criticize for that because they don't understand its function as part of Bayesian logic.
Yeah. Yeah, it's basically, Bayesian logic basically looks at our total understanding of the world to get the probability of certain new facts about it, to reason about our world, and, to new information. And we can't actually look at everything, extensively everything, but, as much as it's relevant to a particular subject matter.
Exactly, and in the real world, you have to take into account evidence that you don't have in order to make decisions.
Yeah. Based on the best
and it's
we
evidence,
know,
because a lot of people are mistaking what he's saying here. He's talking about actual evidence, not. Oh, I can't even think of some of the arguments I've heard, but.
Yeah. So based on the best we know, what should we conclude? Is what Bayes is trying to do.
Exactly.
And this is all about quantifying. Well, what is the best we know? How do we quantify that, and how do we organize it? In the concluding part of chapter 7, in truth, the only evidence that Jesus really existed as an historical person, as opposed to merely being believed to have existed by the dawn of the 2nd century, lies in the contents of the New Testament. There is no other source, document, or artifact that independently corroborates the historical reality of Jesus. In most cases, this is obvious, but in some it is disputed, and in those cases, Carrier would take up the next chapter. Sorry, I read that last part wrong, but I hope you followed me.
Yeah, I was reading along.
Yeah. I didn't change the I to Carrier there, and I had to reword it halfway through reading it. Yeah.
I couldn't even see that error, so,
Yeah.
Bad eyes.
Yeah. So yeah, I think chapter 7 covered a lot of good basis, but it's just kind of a broad summary of what's to come later. So if we missed anything in 7, we'll return to it.
And also, this is the area we're probably most familiar with through our own studies. So, this is kind of like, I don't want to say old hat, but it's not. It's the area of the extra-biblical evidence of which I really don't have any real firm knowledge of, and that's why it seems to be more interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm expecting this book to get better as we go along. I've heard that certain things are in this book being discussed, and I haven't gotten to them yet. So I'm thinking all the good stuff's probably about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through the book.
And also check out that blog post. It goes into a great deal about Ignatius and how the dating problem got out of hand. One of the comments was that, well, maybe it's not interesting to you because you're only giving us just 1 or 2 examples or something like that. But not the full thing that he was actually going through. But the commenter said it was interesting the way it was written, and it is. It's really good. So if you do get a chance, take a look at that one.
Oh, yeah, I will, yeah. So how far do we want to try to get for next week? I
Let's
made
say
the up to 8.5, but I don't think we can get that far next week.
Probably not, if you want to still keep it at that.
Yeah, I'll just stick with 8.5 as a goal.
Yeah.
I'll
probably read through the entire chapter, but, it doesn't necessarily mean that.
That's about 35 pages, so it's not horribly bad.
No, it was, but it was very interesting, because some of that stuff has a lot of cross-referencing to do in order for you to really get a good grounding in it.
Yeah, and we can look at my outline if you want to get a glimpse of what's coming ahead here.
I was looking at evidence.
Yeah, he talks about Epiphanius writing that the Nazarenes say Jesus had lived and died at the time of Alexander Jannaeus, and the Babylonian Talmud it seems to concur with that. It seems like they're responding to that brand of Christianity.
That I would agree with, and that's why I say I'm not saying that there's no Jesus in the Talmud, but the Christian Jesus doesn't seem to be there, not the one that we're familiar with. But there could have been, as you say, other understandings that were more available to the Jews writing the Talmud.
Well, it has Jesus as crucified. It has
Well,
them.
one of them, anyway.
It has them being, his mother being Mary. So I mean, those are a couple of close connections to the canonical view.
Well, elsewhere in the book, he argues for the commonness of names. Just every woman named Mary, apparently.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or would be the other one?
Yeah.
A very common one. I can't think of it now.
And then he has the Socrates analogy coming up later, which is basically that we actually do have good evidence that Socrates existed. That's kind of beyond dispute. And he explains why that's different than the case for Jesus. A lot of people claim we have more information, more evidence for Jesus than any other historical character at the time. That's simply not true. Not true at all. There's many other people at that time period we have better evidence for than Jesus.
Yeah, there was, I think, on Acharya S.'s forum, I almost got sucked into a debate about that, but I decided not to.
Yeah. But, and then he talked, we'll discuss this more next week, but the missing evidence, stuff that we don't see in the early Christian writings and things we don't see in early secular writings, and why not?
Yeah, that was fascinating. I remember reading that earlier this week.
And then talking about Clement of Rome again, why he believes that's early and what it actually says and doesn't say. So that'll be for next week.
Sounds good.
So good night, everyone, and see you next week.
Hopefully we'll be more lively.
I'm the one waving when I'm not on camera. Just imagine my hand going across the screen.
Okay. All right. Take care, Wayne. Thank you, Reuben. Have a good